Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Tuesday, June 3rd, 2014. Getting into the week, all kinds of stuff going on. We got a very busy news day today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Sam is sitting in our control room, his hand hovering over the phone, ready to swoop on down and grab it when it rings. Put you on the air to talk about whatever it is that riles you today here. Now, obviously, the big breaking news right now is this whole exploding scandal of this supposed Taliban prisoner of war, Bergdahl. And Obama made a big deal. He traded 5 captured Taliban officials that were taken during the invasion of Afghanistan to get this guy Bergdahl back. And he was bringing this guy back. You know, he's been in captivity for 5 years. We're bringing him home. See, we look after our serving military. And he's trying to desperately offset that VA scandal. And so he just did this publicity stunt. He took these 5 Taliban officials from Guantanamo and sent them back. Got Bergdahl back, and now this latest publicity stunt has blown up in his face just like Benghazi did. Because and we teased this yesterday, that this was already starting to break back then. This Bergdahl wasn't a prisoner. He was a deserter and possibly a collaborator. And so it's this huge, and of course, John McCain's having a field day with this. He can't keep the grin off his face, going on about this. Was this even legal to do it? And they're going back and forth. Earlier today, Jay Carney's replacement at the White House is starting off his new job here with trial by ordeal, I guess. Because the spin they were trying to put out earlier is, well, it doesn't really matter if he was a deserter or not. We're showing our commitment to bring all of our boys home, which we know that's a complete lie. Because a lot of those sealed coffins that come back from the war zone have nothing in them but a big lead weight. So you've got something to bury and cry over and achieve closure. But apparently it was known at the time he left he was deserting. He left notes. He'd been sending emails, which, by the way, if you're in the military, just count on your emails being read all the time, saying how disgusted he was with America, how this war was not at all what they'd been told it was about. And apparently he was saying he wanted to leave, and his father came back and said, do what your conscience tells you, which appears to be what happened. So they've known all along this guy wasn't a POW. He wasn't taken prisoner by the Taliban. It's another concocted story to sort of create this illusion of heroic American militaryhood, like Pat Tillman or Jessica Lynch, and those stories turn out to be completely bogus. Special forces apparently have known all along where this guy was staying, and they wouldn't authorize a rescue because they didn't want him coming back. See, here's a problem. The government doesn't admit that desertion is a major problem. Might give all those other soldiers and sailors and airmen other ideas. During World War II, during these horrible daylight bombing raids over Germany, that were costing so many American lives. Well, a lot of those planes that didn't come back, didn't crash, and weren't shot down, they were flown to neutral countries and landed in a meadow someplace, and the crew just got out and took on whole new lives. So they don't like to admit it when there's a desertion problem going on in the military, but it does seem like there is. We got reports from that Fort Hood shooting that was blamed on a convenient Muslim, that what actually happened is a group of soldiers who had come back, thought their tours of duty were over, were informed, hey, sorry, stop loss, we're going to send you back for another tour, and they freaked and they opened fire on their officers, and it had to be hushed up because of all the other military that are just at the breaking point from all of this nonsense that's going on. But Bergdahl was writing in his emails, I am sorry for everything here. These people need help, yet what they get is the most conceited country in the world telling them they are nothing and they are stupid. He described his battalion commander as a conceited old fool and said the only decent sergeants were all planning to leave as soon as they could get out and were actively telling the soldiers, you do the same, get out as quick as you can. And he concluded by saying, I am ashamed to be an American. And the title of U.S. soldier is just the lie of fools. I am sorry for everything. The horror that is America is disgusting. Perfectly in agreement with everything he's saying. And so this latest publicity stunt from the White House has just blown up in Obama's face. It's a huge embarrassment. Well, now they've had to back off that thing about, oh, it doesn't matter if he deserted. You know, we got him back. He's coming home, and he's a hero. Remember yesterday Obama was posing with his parents to get his, picture back in the media. And now today they're having to say that, yeah, actually, given all the evidence that he himself left, not just the emails, but notes left on his bunk when he walked off the base in Afghanistan, they're going to bring him up now on desertion charges. Going to face a court-martial. And everybody's laughing at Obama because he traded these 5 top Taliban officials to get back one guy that was being promoted as a returning hero, and now it turns out he was a deserter all along. Oh, my goodness. Okay, so do we have Steve in Massachusetts or not? I'm not.
No, not right now.
Not right now. Okay, all right. Over in Ukraine, 2 more helicopters have been shot down. And video has surfaced of these helicopter gunships simply strafing the ground in the eastern Ukraine. Just anybody at all. They're just coming in there. We reported on the bombing of civilians yesterday, and at first the junta in Kiev was saying, no, it's not us. Who would it be? Oh, they're bombing themselves to make us look bad. And now they are confirming that the Air Force working for Kiev fired over 150 missiles into Lugansk. Now, missiles are not very discriminating. They kill everybody. And these strikes were carried out with non-guided missiles. In other words, just simple solid fuel rocket, explosive tip, just an area denial weapon, blowing everything up. This is Poroshenko proving he's a tough guy and a strong man. And he's just going to go out and kill everybody until the survivors agree to live the rest of their lives enslaved to the European Central Bank. That's what's going on here. So, of course, Obama wants to spend another $1 billion to fortify Europe against the Russian threat. That's what's going on over here. Meanwhile, of course, in Syria, where they're saying that Syria's government is killing the Syrian people, which doesn't really seem to be going on, but that's the lie, and that's why we're supposed to go in and invade Syria and take out this evil government that's killing its own people. But up in Ukraine, we've got an equally evil and, I might add, installed by force government that's killing their own people, and the U.S. is just shoveling ammunition and military supplies at them as fast as they can. There's no consistent theme in America's foreign policy other than if you do what we say, we will support you, and if you have even a shred of independent spirit in you, we will bomb you and kill you and seriously mess you up. Meanwhile, up at the United Nations, Russia has gone into the Security Council with a new resolution calling for an immediate end to all violence in Ukraine and a ceasefire. And that's it. That's all they're asking for. And I'm going to guarantee you right now the United States is going to veto it. Meanwhile, down in Syria, they're having their elections, and as expected, Assad is winning by a landslide, and equally as expected, the American corporate media and the U.S. government are saying, oh, it doesn't mean anything. It's a complete sham. It's complete fraud here. The Syrian people actually hate this guy. They're voting for him because they're afraid of him, which is nonsense because Syria's elections are the good old-fashioned one where you mark your ballot inside a little booth, put it in a box, your name is not on it, nobody knows how you voted. And besides which, if the Syrian people didn't want Assad, they wouldn't bother showing up to vote at all, certainly not in those outlying consulate areas. And Assad would have as low a voter turnout as Sisi just did in Egypt. So this whole election is absolutely destroying the U.S. justification for the covert attempted overthrow of Syria. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And Sam in the control room just notified me that apparently we had another strange dropout of our Skype connection during the last segment, and neither one of us can remember what I was talking about, but it probably wasn't important anyway. Or maybe it was really important. Somebody didn't want you to hear it. There seems to be a lot of that going on. Been a couple of attacks on my server. And have you seen all the news coverage? Everybody's saying, 2 weeks to a major cyber attack. I have a very serious concern about that. We'll talk about it a little bit later in the show, but I want to finish up on all the news on all the wars that the United States has started all over the globe here. There's a very alarming story coming out of Afghanistan. Apparently, a drone strike in Afghanistan seriously injured a 4-year-old girl. In fact, it's described as she basically had her face blown off in this drone strike. And apparently what is now coming out, the family is saying U.S. military forces came in and kidnapped this 4-year-old girl, and she's now, if she's still alive, in an undisclosed location. Apparently they're very concerned that somebody was going to get a picture of that and put it out there on the social media and upstage of those cops down in Georgia who flashbanged a little baby in a crib last week. But they're running around scrambling, trying to keep a lid on all of this stuff. By the way, speaking of keeping a lid on, over in Saudi Arabia, for the last 3 years, there's been a growing movement against the Saudi royal family's rule, which tends to be pretty much corrupt, as is every other government on earth. And apparently it's been building for 3 years, and it's not getting a lot of coverage here in the U.S. because the Saudi government is buddy-buddy with the U.S. government, and therefore they're the good guys, and we don't talk about how unhappy their people are. We're seeing the same thing over in places like Bahrain. It's only if we don't like the government that the U.S. corporate media will report on those poor, struggling, suffering people yearning for freedom. So, anyway. Now, yesterday, following the swearing in of the new unity Palestinian government, Benjamin Netanyahu was out whining all over the world to anybody who would still listen to him about how anybody who works with the new Palestinian unity government is supporting terror, that really you're a bunch of anti-Semites and Hitler lovers and the rest of it. And apparently it's falling on deaf ears, including here in the United States of America, where the U.S. government now officially recognizes the Palestinian unity government and is willing to basically talk with them about resolving some of these matters there. And, of course, today Israel's Netanyahu and various government officials, members of the Knesset, are out there just screaming at the United States, how dare you do that? You're not allowed to deal with any government we don't approve for you. And they're out there making all these dire predictions saying, you know, any collaboration with Hamas and they kill women and children, like Israel hasn't been all along here. And it's really ironic because the reality is Hamas was initially created and funded by Israel, specifically by the security service Shin Bet, in order to be a controlled opposition to Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization. See, Israel likes to play this little game. To get out of having actual, real, meaningful peace talks with Palestine, they always like to have at least two groups claiming to be the government. And then Israel can say, well, we don't know if we're supposed to talk to these people or these other people over here, so we're not going to show up at the peace talks. And when Yasser Arafat pulled the PLO together and it looked like he was going to unify all Palestine, Israel covertly set up Hamas so they could go on playing that same game. Do we talk to PLO? Or do we talk to Hamas? And we don't know, so we're not going to show up at the peace talks. Then Yasser Arafat was assassinated, the PLO collapsed, and all of a sudden Hamas found itself the de facto government of a unified Palestine. And Israel panicked and set up what eventually became Fatah, so they could go on playing the same avoidance game again. Do we talk to Hamas or do we talk to Fatah? We don't know, so we're not going to show up at the peace talks. And that's why they're in such a panic now that Fatah and Hamas have shaken hands and formed a new unified Palestinian government, because now Israel has lost that little game they like to play about not knowing who they should talk to, because Hamas and Fatah has just gotten together and said, you talk to us. And if you don't, then we know it's Israel that doesn't really want peace, which we've kind of known all along. We're going to grab a quick phone call here. John in Chicago. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Fine.
All right. I just saw this over at the Daily Paul. I guess it's a few days old, but, you know, Ted Cruz is on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I guess he voted with everyone else to pass the part of the NDA that says we need to arm the Syrian rebels. And it was only Mike Lee of Utah that said no. He said that'd be like pouring gasoline on the fire. But you got to keep hammering this point home over and over and over again until these people get it, because, like you said, Obama just went to Poland, didn't he, yesterday? And he said, hey, the chocolate oligarch in Ukraine's got to keep doing his thing to keep the Eastern guys in line.
Mm-hmm.
So they still want to overthrow Assad. They still want to arm al-Qaeda, which is hypocrisy. And then looking through the list of the guys on the membership committee, I see Jeff Sessions is on there too. Now, remember when Jeff Sessions was absolutely outraged when Leon Panetta told him right to his face that when NATO calls our troops out, we go?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's a lot of positive talk about Ted Cruz, but, I mean, I'm just absolutely sick of hearing it. None of these guys are worth their salt at all.
All right,
They just
change
want
channels
more war,
then.
More war.
Change channels
What's
then. Okay, all right, we're going to let you go. And by the way, there is one misstatement I have to take issue with. Members of these committees don't pass portions of a bill. They assemble the bill, and then it goes to the floor for a vote, and it's an all-or-nothing deal. For a long time, there was talk about a presidential line-item veto, possibly as a way of getting around this problem of members of Congress loading up a bill that's certain to pass with all kind of irrelevant riders that couldn't stand a chance on their own. I'll give you a good example. The Homeland Security Act. Everybody said this is going to pass here, so they put in that provision indemnifying vaccine manufacturers from damages caused by their products. Now, by itself, that bill would not have been able to pass the Congress, but they tack it into this other, and it rides through. That's why they call it a rider. And when you see a bill going before Congress, you have to look out for that little phrase that they use in the title, and for other purposes, because that is basically advertising that buried somewhere in that giant stack of paper are some things that they're trying to have run into the law by means of attaching it to a bill that's certain to pass. And it's probably stuff that you definitely should be paying attention to if you're a member of Congress here. Now, getting on back over to the war zones, plural, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Yukiya Amano, is out there saying Iran's compliance with the P5+1 preliminary agreement has been complete and total. And he says Iran is doing everything that they promised to do. And then, of course, he backs off and says, there's always going to be room for doubt. There's always going to be room for doubt. So basically what they're saying is Iran is keeping their side of the agreement, even though the United States isn't, but we still have to be suspicious of Iran. It's amazing. Meanwhile, if you live in Delaware, be prepared for some heavy traffic for the coming weeks here, because apparently the Interstate 495 bridge over the Christina River in Wilmington has been closed when they discovered 4 of its support columns are now tilting, going off plumb line, as it were. This bridge normally carries about 90,000 vehicles a day, and they're going to have to basically shut it down until either they repair it or replace the bridge here. So Obama can spend another $1 billion to guard against the Russian threat, and $18 million to Kiev to murder Ukrainians, but continues to let the critical infrastructure of the U.S. rot. We got to take a break for commercials. We got a caller on the line. I'm going to take your call as soon as we come back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're going to go right to the phones. Carl in North Carolina, thank you for waiting. What's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing, Mr. Rivero?
Doing fine.
What I was calling about today is the 16th Amendment. I've heard you state several times that when the federal judge, I believe it was a district court judge in Chicago, I believe, in, I don't know, 1937, sometime back, when they challenged the validity of whether the 16th Amendment was ratified or not. I've heard you speak of this, and I wanted to let you know that that's a bit of a rat hole or a rabbit hole, for the mere fact that the 16th Amendment can't be enforced because it flies directly in the face of, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8.
You're absolutely right.
Right. That's why it was never ratified, because it couldn't be ratified. You'd have to first repeal Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 before you could even think of ratifying.
Okay, you're very close. First of all, let me correct a couple of things. The lawsuit that we're referring to is Sullivan versus United States, and it wasn't back in the 1930s. It happened quite recently because the actual purpose of the lawsuit was to invalidate the war in Iraq because it lacked a constitutional declaration. and the judge was trying to explain to the petitioner why, sometimes things that aren't the letter of the law are simply treated as if they're the law because, once out of they've gotten away with it a few times, they're in the habit, they continue to do it. And he chose as his example of that the 16th Amendment. He admitted in the court record that on examination, the 16th Amendment was not legally ratified. Then he goes on to say, but we've been acting as if it was real for so long that we all just treat it like it was ratified. So all the judges know that this is a huge fraud that's going on. Now, with regard to the ratification, it might have been ratified. If the 3/4 of the states in existence at the time had voted for it, it could have been ratified, but you're absolutely right. It would have directly conflicted with the provision in the Constitution that says all direct taxes have to be apportioned. Now, the rules for the Constitution are that it must be internally self-consistent, and to be of proper form, the 16th Amendment should have simply said, Article 1, Section 8, wherever that is, the apportionment clause is hereby repealed, and then go on to say the government can grab money from anybody that it wants to do. Because of that deficiency and some other issues, the United States Supreme Court ruled in a case called Stanton versus Baltic Mining that the 16th Amendment did not actually confer any new tax authority on the U.S. government. It was effectively null and void. And so, again, the government is telling you this is what the law is, but it isn't really if the government's clearly not been playing by the rules all along. They're just rely on the corporate media to say, oh, yes, we've just made up a new law and it's perfectly valid. Let's just take more of your money to give to the bankers. There's a guy by the name of Bill Benson who literally did the research. He went to all of the states that had been in existence in 1916, went into their state archives, and he looked at the actual bills of ratification. And he found all these problems where the bill didn't actually pass. It wasn't actually signed by the governor, where they had rewritten the amendment, and you're not allowed to do that. It's an invalid ratification if you change the wording or even the punctuation. And he put together a 2-volume set of books called The Law That Never Was. And it's caused quite a bit of a stir, and the government has tried to suppress it. They went after him legally. Everybody who stands up to this fraud, they're going to get attacked. Joe Bannister is a good example. I mean, he's a former IRS investigator, carried a gun, and he started hearing about all this hemming and hawing, and he said, I need to know for my own conscience before I pull a gun on an American taxpayer that the law is really on my side. Where is the law that says this is, we're supposed to be collecting taxes on, I think it was the issue of taxes on wages and salaries, coming out of the idea that since you're trading your labor for your paycheck, there's no profit, and therefore no taxes due on that. And I may be guessing on that one. But basically, the IRS told Joe Bannister, we're going to process your retirement immediately, or your resignation immediately, and they basically kicked him out. And we've seen that from a lot of these people who work inside the tax system, where all of a sudden they wake up one morning and saying, wait a minute, something just doesn't seem right here. And, of course, the IRS will fire them or resign them or retire them or something like that and get them on out of there. But all of these various tax protest movements have for more than 10 years gone to the Internal Revenue Service and said, let us please settle this matter now once and for all. Okay? Just show us.
See the law, correct? They kept wanting to redress of grievances and to see the law, and that's another one of my points. I've looked into this for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. There isn't a law. You are giving your money to the Internal Revenue, and people may think I'm trying to plug one of your sponsors, but I'm not. It really is by contract, because there is no viable law. And that's why they won't, when they go to Washington for redress of grievances, or they just keep saying, just show me the law. You're not going to see a law because there is no law.
Well, this is where the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department are immune from these constitutional restrictions. I mean, they like to sort of present a quasi-governmental image, but the reality is the Internal Revenue Service is a private collection corporation. working for a privately owned central bank. And they like to pretend they're part of the government. That's why the Federal Reserve calls itself the Federal Reserve, but it's no more federal than Federal Express. And yet, when people try to file Freedom of Information Act requests against the Federal Reserve, the first thing they say is, hey, we're a private bank here, and, we're not subject to that law. So, basically...
You're under contract. If you're under contract, that basically supersedes the Constitution, because anybody in America has the unlimited right to contract. Otherwise, we couldn't exist. We couldn't do business. And so sometimes that's going to interfere with your constitutionally protected rights. So you have to have the unlimited right to contract to have a free society.
Okay, now let me get a comment here. I haven't actually looked at this. The product or the book or whatever it is they're selling about this contract issue. But one of the essences of contract law is that both parties have to know all the terms of the contract. And so, if the IRS is claiming that we're supposed to pay them taxes because we have contracted with them to do so, where did that contract come from? When did we sign it? They can't just do this idea that, when you accept a taxpayer identification number, that obligates you to the contract even though you've never seen it. That wouldn't hold up in a court of law.
Exactly, it wouldn't hold up, but nobody ever challenges it in such a manner. And I promise you that as soon as somebody tries to challenge it in such a manner, they'll just say, well, you know what, we'll let you buy this time, just pay your taxes and don't worry about it. Well,
listen, we're coming up on a commercial break, so I'm going to have to let you go here. With regard to the taxes, they're going to take your money, period, end of discussion. The judges in those courts, their salaries come from tax money. The court building is built with tax money. All the people who work there are paid from tax money. It's a clear conflict of interest. They are not interested in the letter of the law or the historical accuracy of your case. In fact, if you walk into a tax law case carrying Bill Benson's book, they'll hit you with a $25,000 fine and say it's trivial nonsense. You're wasting the court's time. I mean, that's how afraid they are of it. What is going to change the system is when, 300 million American taxpayers all stand up and say this has been a gigantic 100-year fraud. And the fact that everybody else around me fell for the fraud doesn't obligate me to go along with it anymore. And that's when things are going to start really, really unraveling, okay? So we're going to let Carl go here. And we're going to start with Art off the grid. And Art, we're probably going to have to take you through the commercial break.
That's okay, Mike. I don't mind. Talking about income tax. This is something I've done a little research on. And what got me into researching this was, you remember what it was, her name, Sherry Jackson?
Yes.
And it wasn't shortly after I heard about her story that I learned about Joe Bannister. And then, I followed his work for quite some time. And I also had contact. I don't know if you are familiar with a fella named Lewis Hughes.
I've heard the name, yes.
He was a guest several times here on RBN back several years ago. I ended up corresponding with him over about a 3-month period while he was educating me on this. And some of the things that I've learned was, one...
Okay, Art, there's the music. Keep that thought. I want you to come right back to it when we return from these commercials. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. And before we go back to Art off the grid here, I'm getting a ton of email, and I got a lot of email yesterday after David Merlin's appearance on the show. And remember, he's now got his own show on RBN Saturday mornings from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. East Coast time talking about these subjects. I got an email saying that apparently Bill Benson's book, The Law That Never Was, that in intense detail shows why the 16th Amendment wasn't actually ratified, is available at the Pirate Bay. I'm a little leery about handing that information out, and I'm not going to link to it because Bill deserves to be paid for his book, which you can order from his website at thelawthatneverwas.com. And also another reminder that if you just go out to any search engine like Google and just type in 16th Amendment never ratified, you will get thousands of hits. Go over to YouTube. There's 100 videos out there from people going in and documenting that this 16th Amendment, which is the foundation for this whole income tax fraud, wasn't actually legally ratified. And remember, the Federal Reserve and that 16th Amendment came in at the exact same time. And because of the trouble they had getting that 16th put over on the people, I think is why they decided to not try and use a constitutional amendment to transfer the government's money creation authority over to that private bank, the Federal Reserve. And instead they met over the Christmas holiday, passed the Federal Reserve Act. Woodrow Wilson signed it to make it law. But it is unconstitutional. The Constitution gives the government the authority to create all money and does not authorize the government to delegate it or transfer it to any third party. So the Federal Reserve Act is unconstitutional. It's part of this gigantic fraud that was perpetrated to sell you into the slavery of these private central bankers. Anyway, let's go back to Art. Art, would you please pick up where you had left off?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mike. And I'm going to bring the Constitution into this as well. And I really wished I could have gotten a chance to talk to David Merlin yesterday, because a couple things I wanted to run by him, and we'll get your thoughts as well. And when he comes to RBN, I will be calling in and running them by him to get his thoughts, because I like to make sure I'm on the right track. And, wow, the information he was throwing out yesterday was just amazing. But it's my understanding, first of all, that the Social Security card is property of the federal government, and by law, only federal employees are allowed to possess them. So it only stands to reason by my logic, and I've got more to go, that if you possess and use one, you are thereby admitting you are a federal employee. And when it comes to who's required to pay federal minimum wage, federal income tax, to my knowledge, the only ones required are things like corporations, businesses, and federal employees. Now, when we talk about income tax, we go to the Constitution and we see in there where it says where Congress has the right to levy taxes and so on, it states from the source derived. Well, we have a Supreme Court case, and I cannot for the life of me remember, somebody may want to research this, a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court stated that your labor is your property,
yes,
and income is defined as profit. Well, this brings into the discussion Section 83 that David Merlin talks about, where it states clearly, and I went and I checked this, and brother, he is dead on the money when he says this. Anything beyond your compensation is taxable income. That means if you work for $5 an hour, you work 20 hours, that's $100. That's not taxable because that's your compensation for your labor. The Supreme Court says labor is private property. Private property cannot be taxed. But if your boss gives you $50 at the end of, say, 3 months and says, this I want to give you to say thank you, that is above your compensation, and that then can be taxed.
Well, that's definitely one of the major points that's out there. I don't want to get lost in the trivia here, but I do want to refer everybody back to this wonderful documentary, America from Freedom to Fascism.
Aaron Russo.
Aaron Russo. I was trying to remember his name there because we had him on the show shortly before he passed away. And there's this wonderful scene where Aaron Russo is literally talking to one of the top officials at the IRS, and he's citing all these Supreme Court decisions, and this IRS official keeps saying, oh, those don't matter anymore. That was long ago. We're not bound by those anymore. That's their attitude.
Yeah.
That's their attitude here. You know, and, I got to relink that to the front page of my website. People need to look at that documentary again.
Yeah, anyone who's not seen that really needs to see that Freedom to Fascism, because it really exposes the true fraud of all of this. And it's wonderful the way he sets it up, where he's got this guy sitting there going, and then, of course, when he confronts Harry, when you have people like Jan Helfield as well, literally confronting Harry Reid face-to-face, and Harry Reid admitting that taxes are voluntary, but then turns right around and says, but if you don't pay them, we'll throw you in jail. Well, first he says, well, we don't throw anybody in jail for not paying. Well, actually, yeah, we do. I mean, this whole thing is just nothing but a fraud.
Yeah,
and
it
so
is.
What I tell people is, just don't. If you want to get, I don't believe in evading taxes because that is illegal. If you evade taxes, that means you actually owe them. But if you can avoid taxes, by all means do it. But if you're going to do it, you need to do what I do. I don't use a Social Security card to secure employment.
Well, that's okay for your particular circumstance here. For me, the issue is one of a government that is lying to us about everything. And the government's going to say, you owe this, you must do that, you have to do that. And trust us, it's all the letter of the law. And then we find out it isn't, that they're just shoveling the USDA choice bovine excrement at us as hard as they can. They're using a snowblower to get our money, our obedience, to get our children to fight in their wars. I mean, the current U.S. government is basically operating on the same moral level as the sheriff of Nottingham, sending out his thugs across the countryside to steal chickens and pigs whenever they feel like it.
Yeah, this is very true. But, you know, there's the old saying that just because you say it doesn't make it true. That's like they would love you to believe that, say, for example, I live in a camper, okay? I live in a 24-foot gooseneck camper. Now, they would like you to believe that I am required by law to pay a tax on this camper every year to keep it tagged and whatnot so I can move it, do whatever I want to do. That's actually not the case because I actually went to the courthouse and I confronted the clerk of court right there in front of everybody and got an open admission that only if and until I register the camper, it can't be taxed. And so when I bought the camper, I forego the title transfer and simply acquired a bill of sale. And you cannot register.
We're getting into a real narrow context situation here that I don't think most of our listeners are really going to find anything applicable to their situation. For me, the issue gets back to one that does affect every single living American and everybody listening to this show. The government is lying to you all the time to get your money, your obedience, your children for wars. And at some point, 300 million Americans are going to have to stand up and say, I've had it. I'm not going to live under a government that lies to me like this. The government, by virtue of all of these lies, has delegitimized itself. I don't recognize or acknowledge it has lawful authority over me any longer. That's when it's going to start coming apart. Okay, so Art, we're going to let you go here. We're coming up here on the top of the hour. And we're going to be looking at some more of the stuff that's going on here. Interesting story out of Extra Public TV. The U.S. drone program under Obama got out of hand. That's certainly true, and that's probably the reason we're getting this story out of Afghanistan about a 4-year-old girl had her face blown off by a drone strike, and parents are saying that U.S. military kidnapped her and took her away so they couldn't take pictures of her. Put it on social media here. Another little piece of good news, finally, a decision out of the United States Supreme Court we can all agree with. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against Obama administration's boundless interpretation of the chemical weapons law. We'll be back after our top of the hour break. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, and I want to sort of zip on back to this whole release of the Taliban officials from Guantanamo in exchange for this soldier. The corporate media focuses on whether Obama acted legally because the law requires Congress to be given 30 days notice before anybody is released from Guantanamo. And, of course, in this case, they were not. The real issue, of course, is this has turned out to be a huge public relations nightmare. Obama was going to go out there and he was going to get our boy back to try and offset the VA scandal, and it's just melting. And he's still pushing that whole issue. Okay, apparently earlier today over in Poland, where he's out there trying to go on interfering with everybody else's countries, he made this bizarre comment that the United States has a sacred rule that it does not leave any prisoners behind in warfare regardless of the circumstances. Okay, now you try and tell that to all those POWs who were abandoned in Vietnam once the war was over. Because when the U.S. lost the war in Vietnam, the government of Vietnam said, we are owed war reparations for all the damage you've caused here. And we're going to keep these POWs until you pay the bill. Once you pay the bill, you can have your kids back. And the U.S. government sat there and said, we're going to save the money, and we're going to let them keep the POWs, and we're going to tell everybody that they're just imagining it in their head when they're concerned that they can't seem to find where their guys went. That's where that whole Vietnam POW MIA issue came from. The U.S. government abandoned all of those American troops in Vietnam so they wouldn't have to sign a check for the war reparations. So don't give me this sacred rule crap, Barry, because this nation does not walk its talk. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are all of a sudden seeing all of this media attention from the corporate media about the coming cyber attacks. Getting a lot of email about this. We know that going back since before Christmas, there have been all of these amazing, newsworthy hacks of computer databases, credit card information. They read my wife's information off of the radio chip in one of her credit cards, which is no longer in existence, I might add. And the NSA, which supposedly monitors all computer communications all around the planet, has yet to find even one of these malefactors. And goodness knows they could use some positive press right about now. Now, I saw this very bizarre story. This is over in AsiaNikkei.com, and apparently former U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta is already out there running around saying there's going to be a new Pearl Harbor, a cyber Pearl Harbor, and it's going to come from China. And they're talking about how so many of these systems that are on, like the space station, are wide open to hacking because they didn't think they were going to have to worry about security there. But they're already out there planning the blame. There's a big cyber attack coming, and it's all going to be China's fault. Story coming out of Investment Watch blog, and this is apparently originating with Sky News because I got several emails about it. We have 2 weeks to prepare for a cyber attack on the bank accounts. This is coming from the British government, reported by Sky News. Now, I wrote an article a while back, and I reprised it to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com, and it was called Virtual 9/11. Will the U.S. and Israel hack the U.S. banking system, computers, and falsely blame it on Iran or Syria or Russia or China? And it basically goes through the fact that right now, absent some kind of a major socially traumatizing event, this government really has lost the trust of the American people. They need a new false flag, something that impacts everybody directly, comes into your home. And certainly the NSA is already positioned to carry out such a false flag because they've already backdoored everything you got, your routers, your tablets, your smartphones, your computers. And, of course, if there's a cyber attack, then the government can say, we must take complete control of the Internet for the good of the children, or whatever else it is they're going to say. And it almost seems with all this news coverage about cyber attacks and it's going to be China's fault and all of the ongoing cyber crime that nobody seems able to do anything about, it suggests to me that they're considering a new 9/11 carried out in cyberspace on the computer network. For one thing, to silence all the blogs out there who might be asking embarrassing questions about why would China do something that stupid? Why would anybody do something like attack the United States of America knowing a swift, crushing military response is going to be the result? And the answer is they're not going to do that. Meanwhile, Attorney General Eric Holder has announced a new task force to deal with homegrown terrorists. Came out there, said they're forming this new we've got to deal with the homegrown terrorists. And he basically came out saying that domestic terrorists, ordinary people like you and me, who don't like the government, were responsible for more than 24 incidents in the United States since 9/11. Now, I thought the NSA was supposed to prevent that from happening. So what Eric Holder is saying is that in point of fact, the NSA can't stop the terrorists. And neither, apparently, can the TSA. Now, where they get these numbers, because they've been asked to document what they're calling an act of terror, and they always back off on it. The government has gotten into the habit of adding a terrorism charge onto ordinary crimes. There was an incident, it was on the news media just yesterday, where this guy comes out of a house and he sees a neighbor helping the first guy's daughter learn to ride a bike with training wheels. And he freaks out, thinks it's a pedophile because that's been on all the news, and he goes and gets a gun to warn the neighbor away from his daughter. Bit of an overreaction. I wonder if he's on SSRIs. The guy who waved the gun at the neighbor was arrested for an ADW, assault with a deadly weapon, and they added to it terroristic threatening. So now he's a terrorist. And, of course, he didn't actually commit or threaten an act of terror. He was overreacting to the neighbor, helping his little girl ride the bicycle. But that's where they're getting the terrorism numbers. They're redefining what terror is in order to come up with numbers to say there are terrorists amongst you. All right, we've had a caller waiting on the line for a little bit. I'm going to get to him. Jerry in Chicago. Aloha, Jerry. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael, and thank you very much for taking my call. And isn't it amazing, all these different agencies that are paid good money to stop all of this different types of cyber crime and all this other stuff seem to fail when it comes down, push comes to shove, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yes, we've been pointing that out for a long time. The whole point of my NSA code challenges was to document and prove that the NSA is really impotent in the face of real criminals and real terrorists, and all of these billions and trillions of dollars have been spent for the NSA to keep watch on us to make sure that we're not thinking those double plus ungood thoughts.
Well, that's not the real reason I called. I wanted to say that I had heard another RBN host talk about he was stationed in Afghanistan the day that this so-called guy walked off the base unarmed in the middle of the night and got himself captured by the Taliban and was gone for 5 years. And now all of a sudden he comes back out into the news and it's a big trade-off and everything else like that. But he said he happened to be stationed over there, and he says, this was a crazy thing that would happen. What's going on? There's more to it than what meets the eye. What do you think?
Well, one of the allegations against this gentleman is that he was actually an active collaborator, that he went over to the other side, and that he may not have actually been a POW or captured at all, that he simply switched sides. The issue, though, for me is that apparently Barack Obama wanted a big heroic return of our lone POW from Afghanistan to prove that we stand by the troops, we have the sacred rule, blah, 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 to offset this growing VA scandal. And as a matter of fact, we just posted another story to whatreallyhappened.com where an accountant at one of these veterans' charities, a bookkeeper, got busted embezzling $800,000. You know, when you see this charity on TV saying, send us money, we'll take care of the veterans. Well, turns out they weren't really doing that. We have to take a break for commercials. Thank you very much for the phone call, Jerry, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And I was just taking a peek over at the blog spot for the Bundy Ranch out in Nevada. Remember that whole thing? The government was going to get tough, and they had the tanks and everything out there. And, well, the Bundys are still on their land. And apparently a documentary is being made about this whole situation called The Last Rancher, where they're basically talking about how all these Western ranchers have been driven out of business by these arbitrary rule changes by the Bureau of Land Management so that their land can be sold to corporate interests or pledged as collateral on the out-of-control government debt here. Now, one of the many groups that is looking into 9/11 is called the 9/11 Consensus Panel. I don't like the word consensus, but that's their name here. They have just released a new report that was peer-reviewed and written by physicists, chemists, engineers, commercial pilots, and lawyers, and basically includes 3 new studies that confirm the controlled demolition of World Trade Center 7. These studies specifically address portions of the 9/11 report issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was trying to tell us all that fire, for the first time in history, caused the sudden and complete collapse of a large, fire-protected, steel-framed building. Now remember, building number 7 was designed to house federal government offices. And those federal office buildings are built to much more rigid standards than ordinary buildings. And what this group found is that in the report issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, there were some outright fabrications. Now, NIST's report was that the fire caused one beam to dislodge off its foundation, and that's what triggered the entire building to come on down. That's their conclusion. what this 9/11 consensus group found. They were able to obtain the original blueprints, construction blueprints for building number 7, and discovered that NIST left out structural elements in the building that would have prevented that from happening. In other words, they came up with their own drawing about, oh, see how flimsy this is, and that's why it came down. One more time, they lied to you. They're lying to you. If at first you don't succeed, lie again. And I will not live, obey, or pay the bills of, or send anybody to die in wars for a government that lies to us. I will have a truthful government, or I will have no government at all. And that is an attitude I think all Americans ought to have right now. Now then. All righty, speaking of 9/11, a little bit of bad news. Right after 9/11, American Airlines suffered a huge drop in business. People got very, very nervous about flying, and many of the American Airlines workers agreed to a 35% pay cut to help American Airlines get through the hard times. In exchange, these workers who took these 35% pay cuts were promised better health care coverage, better retirement benefits, flying benefits, and it turns out they have not received any of those at all. Management at American Airlines is, thank you for taking the pay cut, but, times are tough, and, we're not going to be able to give you all the things that we said we were going to give you for taking those pay cuts here. We're going to take a phone call here. David in Boston. Aloha. David, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, yeah. Aloha, Michael.
Yes.
Michael, you remember yesterday I called you when I mentioned about Hillary back in about 3 years ago and complaining about how the globalists were losing the information war?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, I put forth the idea that, that Snowden could very easily, very well be a tool.
We did talk about that, yes.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is, what I find is the Snowden revelations has had a chilling effect up here in Boston.
Okay, David, you said all this yet? David, come on. All right. We already covered this yesterday, and if there was some great plot to let us all know that the U.S. government was violating the Constitution, to spy on us all, to get us to shut up, it has not worked. And certainly among the people that I am talking to, they are angry. They are outraged. It's gone back completely the other direction here. All righty, anyway. Now, over in Spain, as you're probably aware, Spain's King Carlos has announced his abdication. He's tired of dealing with Catalonia and the Basque and the hard economy and everything, and he's going to quit and turn control over to his son, Prince Philip. Maybe the announcement of the abdication has triggered massive protests all across Spain against having a monarchy at all. And they're bringing their guillotines along. And the slogan is neither king nor master, and they're demanding a referendum to form a completely new democratic government of Spain. That's going to really annoy the globalists. Meanwhile, over in Thailand, even as the military continues to use violence to try and quell the protests down against their king, protesters in Thailand are apparently big fans of the movie Hunger Games, and they've adopted that three-finger salute that was one of the symbols of the resistance among the people in those movies. It's also the Boy Scout sign. I don't know how they got that in there. But apparently that is now becoming a sign of recognition and defiance all across Thailand. Now, there's an interesting story over at The Guardian. Who's in control, nation states or global corporations? And it's an article that's worth reading because it goes into extreme detail in showing how these large financial corporations are openly and blatantly using their influence and wealth to reshape governments around the world to their own benefit. And they're talking about why Brazil is now suddenly on the special high-interest targets list because their new incoming president is talking about just telling the IMF to get out of Brazil, and their debt is illegitimate. And it is, because the IMF, like every other private central bank, is a system that is intentionally designed to produce more debt than money with which to pay that debt, to enslave the nation and its people into hopelessly unpayable debt, and over time to transfer the real assets of the nation and the people into the pockets of the bankers. And all they've paid for all of this wealth is the cost of ink and paper. And more nations, more and more government, more and more people are beginning to realize what an incredible scam it is. It's rule by compound interest. And it's no more legitimate a form of government than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. And like those former systems, it works only so long as ordinary people are brainwashed into believing that this is the way the world is supposed to be. And other ways of running banking and an economy and a better life for the people are hidden from them. Remember back in 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, all of the public schools in America stopped talking about the Currency Act as being the cause of the American Revolution. And they switched over to say, oh, it's about tea in Boston Harbor, and it's about the Stamp Act and all this other stuff, and they stopped talking about the Currency Act. Even though if you go and you read the writings of Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and other founding fathers, it was that Currency Act that led to the American Revolution. And now we're back in exactly the same predatory private central banking system. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Before we get back to more of the financial news here, this is getting interesting. Of course, Secretary of State John Kerry is already out there saying the Syrian elections are a farce, and it's being picked up by NPR, Associated Press, ABC, all the Western media. Oh, it's a farce, a joke. It's completely illegitimate. You know, well, Assad may have just yanked the rug out of them because now that he has secured his re-election, he is now offering to form a coalition government with all of the opposition groups in Syria. Brilliant move. After 3 years, I'm sure these, except for the hired mercenaries who don't get a paycheck as long as Assad is still in office, but all of the other opposition people, Assad said, look, come on in. Let's set up and make this thing happen together. That may be the end of the Syrian civil war. It's going to leave the U.S. dangling with a major whoopsie in their foreign policy. Apparently, more deaths are now linked to GM cars with those faulty switches. Oh, my goodness. Let's see. I'm going to go back to this other stuff here. Now, back to the economy. Over at ZeroHedge.com, Steen Jacobson is saying that we should see as large as a 30% stock market correction sometime before the end of the year, in the next 6 months. And basically, Steen is out there saying that all of these policies adopted by the U.S. federal government and the Federal Reserve to pour in trillions of instantly created money all over Wall Street in the hope that some of it would trickle down to ordinary people obviously didn't work. Which is what I was saying it was not going to work back in 2008. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of being trickled on all the time by the money junkies. Now, Steen's article stopped short of pointing out the reason this nation is crippled by debt is we are enslaved to a banking system that by design creates more debt than money to pay that debt. We call it the 11th marble concept. And I was informed that one of the big Wall Street financial firms hired some expensive professor of economics to explain why this was complete nonsense, this 11th marble idea. And apparently he couldn't really tear it apart. It's a very simple, clear concept here. Now, what happened when the mortgage-backed security fraud in 2008 collapsed is the U.S. government started taking trillions of dollars from the American people to give to the banks so the banks could loan it back to the American people at interest. Swell deal for the banks. Not so good for you and I. Now, if they had gone to all these Wall Street firms that were behind this fraud and taken trillions of dollars from them and returned it to the people, nobody would have missed a mortgage payment. There wouldn't have been a housing crash. Nobody would have missed a credit card payment. There wouldn't have been a credit crunch. People would have gone out and bought brand new American-made cars, probably not GM. Wouldn't have had to bail out the automotive industry. People would be going down to the shopping malls and buying all kinds of hopefully made-in-America products. There wouldn't be a retail crisis. Everything, without exception, that the U.S. government did in response to the collapse of the mortgage-backed security fraud in 2008 was absolutely the wrong thing to do, and it made the problem worse, not better. It certainly made the one-percenters much richer and happier, but you can't run a country by catering to only the ultra-rich. That's fascism. Now, we understand money junkies are always going to behave like money junkies. And we understand that they're always going to be greedy and do whatever they can to get money. The function of government is to stand as an intermediary between the greed of the corporations and the general good of the nation and balance the two. And the federal government abandoned that role. They're firmly in the court with the money junkies because they're all money junkies themselves, with precious few exceptions. Now, in another blow to the U.S. dollar hegemony over the world, apparently an RMB yuan clearing bank will be officially open in London this month. And that means that British subjects and the Chinese financial system are now going to be doing their currency exchanges directly without having to go through the U.S. dollar. So even Great Britain is saying we've had enough with this dollar stuff here. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, and I want to go into it in a little more depth, when a government issues a bond issue for some kind of construction, we need to build a new bridge, it's going to cost $25 billion. And that's what the voters think, all right, $25 billion. These numbers never include interest on that debt and the banker's fees. And this interest and the fees can more than double the original cost of the bond issue. In other words, and we see this in the housing market as well, the bankers make more money off of typing a number into a computer than the people who actually build the physical house make. It seems like there's something seriously wrong with that system, that if you actually make something, you build a home or you build a bridge or you dig a tunnel, that you are making less money for that than the bankers did by simply printing up the cash and saying, here's your permission slip to go ahead and make this happen. There's something out of kilter there. I understand that regular banking, general banking, is necessary and important function in society. But this idea of forcing everybody to conduct everything on a debt basis makes the bankers our lords and nobility, which is why they're treated so gently by the court system here. Meanwhile, we're getting this very bizarre report. This is coming out of labornotes.org. Social Security is talking about closing all of their field offices. And that if you have to deal with Social Security, you will go through their web interface. I hope it's not written by the same people who did healthcare.gov. And they're going to lay off 30,000 field office employees. Now, what I suspect may be going on is Social Security is now broke. Starting in the Clinton administration, the cash surplus that was built up for the baby boomer retirements was borrowed and replaced with Treasury bonds, which the U.S. government cannot redeem. The U.S. government is already in a state of default on Treasury bonds. And they chose Social Security's trust fund as where to default because the American people can't do anything about it. We can't lower the government's credit rating. We can't say your rating is now Z minus. And I think they're closing the field offices because when the Social Security checks stop, that's where a lot of very angry Americans are going to start gathering. And they don't want to be providing easy targets for the zombies, which is the military code name for really angry American. Now, up in Illinois, their legislature actually seriously considered allocating $100 million of Illinois tax dollars for the Obama Presidential Library. And what made this really amazing is the president hasn't actually decided where his library will be. I think it should be down on Guam, but that's a personal thing here. Now, the bill did not pass, but it's a reminder that these state governments are pandering to Washington, D.C. because they want to get there. And they see their position in the state government as, just on-the-job training for the big promotion. And that's why very often they're going to side with the federal government, even against the citizens of their own states. Everyone's been talking about illegal immigration and how bad it is to use illegal immigrants. And it turns out the U.S. government is using more illegal immigrants than anybody else. When they grab these illegal immigrants and they put them in detention centers and they're using them as cheap labor. Sometimes they get $1 a day. Sometimes they don't even get that. And they're supposed to be allowed to work only to benefit the detention centers, but apparently now they've set up these operations to prepackage meals for prisoners at other jails. So the government's attitude is it's illegal to use illegal immigrants for cheap labor, but it's okay for us to do it. And meanwhile, of course, American businesses that were set up to support the prison industrial complex are now driven out of business. Now, here's an interesting little story. For the longest time, Microsoft was dissing the idea of open source software. But the times they are a-changing, and they seem to be sort of turning around and embracing this idea that maybe open source is going to produce better products at lower cost to the people. They want in on it, but they're softening their attitude against open source. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, over at the FCC, they are accepting public comments regarding the end of net neutrality, which has a lot of people very, very upset. And apparently, John Oliver over at the Comedy Channel, he's got his own show now called Last Week Tonight, and he made this very humorous, impassioned plea for Americans to do something about the FCC's pending net neutrality rules. And apparently, in response to that, plus online activism, the FCC's commenting system appears to be completely overwhelmed and inaccessible. You can still email them, but there's a huge public outcry. And the FCC is standing there with their fingers in their ears and saying, no, we're not getting any comments in support of net neutrality. Really, we're not doing that. Anyway. Now, if you are using WordPress, you need to be aware of a plugin called the All-in-One SEO Pack. Apparently, it contains multiple serious vulnerabilities that open up WordPress websites to all kinds of mischief. Supposedly, there is now an update to this all-in-one plugin, version 2.1.6, that closes these vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, over at the NSA, not content with our phone calls and our emails and all the rest of that, apparently they are now collecting millions of faces from web images to build a giant facial recognition database. They're going to go out and find all the pictures that are confirmed to be of Michael Rivero and put it in a computer so that as I walk down the street and I'm not wearing my little cap with the IR LEDs on the front to block out the camera image, that the computer will say, yes, there goes Michael Rivero. He's walking down and, oh my goodness, he's going into the donut store. We must tell his wife. Now, first of all, I'm aware there are some pictures out there of people that are labeled as being me, and they're not me. Second of all, to date, facial recognition technology has not been very effective. They tried one of these systems down at an airport in Miami a few years ago, and it got thousands, literally thousands, of false positives. The system would say, this is a known terror suspect, and they'd yank these people out, keep them off the airplane. Turned out they were completely innocent. They didn't actually catch a single guilty person. It's as big a failure as the TSA, which for more than 10 years now has been groping our crotches, giving us their sexually transmitted diseases, molesting our children, humiliating our wives, stealing our iPads and everything on else, and have yet to actually find a single real terrorist. Now, there's a story that came out at RINF.com on the top 5 claims that defenders of the NSA have to stop making to remain credible. And it's basically going down all the claims that the NSA has made and continues to make, even though they have all been completely discredited. Remember when they were out there saying the NSA stopped 54 terrorist attacks? Really? Can you name them? No, it's national security. Just take our word for it. No, those days are gone. When the American people would just take the word of the government or the corporate media, those days are gone. And the sooner you understand that, the better off we're all going to be. The word of the United States federal government is absolutely worthless. It's zero, only because negative numbers are not allowed. Now, apparently, following a ruling by the European Court of Justice that people have a right to be forgotten by Google, thousands of people are availing themselves of that system to erase Google search results that they don't like. Things that they did that were embarrassing, past criminality, can all be erased. We don't have that here in the United States, but they do have it now in Europe. It's the beginning of a trend. And I would absolutely agree. Anybody that's collecting information on you, you should have a mechanism to erase information. It's your information. It's your life. It's your pictures. It's your words. And yes, you made the choice to put it out there on the internet, but along with that is the right to eventually take it back, because we all change as we age. Our opinions change. 20 years ago, when I was first starting on all this blogging, I wrote a lot of things that I don't exactly agree with any longer. One particular embarrassing thing is I kept making the statement that I'm sure it's just a few bad individuals in government and the rest of the government are all a bunch of swell people who will eventually stand up and fix things. That turned out to be one of the biggest goofs I've ever made, and I'd like to be able to erase that. But I think it should be there. I think people should be able to remove themselves from web search engines and say, I don't want people following me or finding me any longer. In particular, people I don't like. Story out of Investment Watch blog. Apparently, the U.S. government is spending huge amounts of your tax dollars to buy Google search terms in order to link White House propaganda to them. They're trying to regain the high ground online. I don't think it's going to work. We're going to grab a phone call here. Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha, Dustin. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to the economy with the BRICS nations. You know, the time they got to change the name from BRICS to like we're alienating all these countries.
There's 80. Yeah, there's 80 nations now. You know.
Yeah, it's like they're going to have to change the name. If Putin was smart, he should go to Spain. You know, all these countries like Greece that are in trouble, and you know, and make some deals with them, or China. You know, because now's the time to really do that.
Well, it's very attractive. That's the reason why the U.S. is pushing the Russian threat. They're trying to revive the Cold War so that automatically Russia is now excluded from the economic trade taking place in all the West's captive nations.
The problem is everything's moving east now, so that's like a mute point. It's like laughable. These people are still living in the 50s.
They are.
Now, did you see the Shanghai Free Trade Zone? And also the gold exchange. There was a video on CNBC with the gold exchange. They showed inside the vaults. It's like state of the art.
Well, I think part of where this gold that was in Fort Knox and was under the New York Federal Reserve, I think a lot of it may have been sent to China so that China would continue to buy U.S. treasuries. Probably China said, we want to hold the collateral ourselves. And that's probably where a lot of Germany's gold got sent to. They're obviously playing fast and loose with all of this gold. And I think what's going on is the attitude in Wall Street and Washington, D.C. is I just got to find some way to keep this going forward until I am out of office or I'm retired and it's somebody else's problem to deal with the resulting crash. And I think that idea of, I know it's all a fraud, I just need to kick it down the road till somebody else gets the blame for it, is the reason we've had this 100-year economic decline in this country.
Oh, yeah, the U.S. dollar is finished. I mean, it's pretty much on the wall. It's going to take some time, to move away from it, but it's finished because no country, you can tell, no country is going to trust the U.S. dollar anymore. That's why it's depreciated. And also, you mentioned the yuan swap facilities. They're popping up all over the place.
Yes, they are. They are. That's
why
Leon Panetta is out there saying there's going to be a cyber attack and China's going to do it. They're desperate to try and solve their problems with another. Well, we're already in World War III, but they really want to crank it up into afterburner overdrive because they think that's going to save them again.
Nobody's going to believe it, though, because you know what? After it's all said and done, they set up all these NSA and the militaries all over the world. What kind of excuse are they going to have when something gets past them again? You had 9/11 get past them, supposedly, and then if something happens again, they'll lose all credibility.
Well, I mean, that the whole Boston bombing, even if you accept the official U.S. government story of the Boston bombing, it means that all this NSA spying and TSA and surveillance and all the rest of it didn't work. Absolutely did not work.
Now, the Russians told us about the two brothers, right? Didn't one brother go into Dagestan? And
yeah, I think these Tsarnaev brothers, we now know they'd been approached by the FBI months before all this happened. I think they were working for the U.S. government as informants, just like we're now finding out Lee Harvey Oswald was working for the FBI as an informant. And they just got set up and used because they needed a couple of patsies for this terror bombing. Okay? Dustin, sorry to cut you off. We're at the top of the hour break, and I got to let you go. We'll be back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Dan the Man is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now then, we're still looking at the aftermath of this horrible incident in Georgia, where this SWAT team doing a dynamic entry into a home threw a flashbang grenade into a baby's playpen, seriously injuring the child. At last report, the child is being kept in a medically induced coma. Horrible burns all over the face. And the official statement coming out of the police department is, we stand by the actions of our police. It was a horrible tragedy. If we'd had the money for night vision goggles, we would have checked our targets before chucking the explosives through the window. Needless to say, the public backlash has got a somewhat different attitude, and now the police are trying to play for sympathy, saying, we're being called baby killers and we're receiving threats. Yeah. You blew up a kid. People are not going to look at that and remain entirely cheerful. What's going on here is the police are being turned into a force to brutalize the American public. They are being trained and equipped not as a civil police force, but as an occupying army. Armored vehicles, body armor, fully automatic weapons. The Anti-Defamation League is now openly bragging in their promotional literature about how they are training U.S. police departments, which is why the American police are now treating the American people the way the IDF treats the Palestinians. And it is a hideous danger. Since 9/11, the U.S. police departments have murdered 8 times as many innocent Americans than the terrorists have. And now we've reached the point of grenades being lobbed into baby cribs. The police are not that swell bunch of Joes that you see in Hollywood movies and TV shows. They're maniacs, hopped up on prescription antidepressants in many cases, just in love with their toys, in love with force. They love kicking down doors and throwing explosives and tasering people. Another report apparently about police tased a pregnant woman. Now, apparently there was a protest against the mayor of Albuquerque demanding changes to the Albuquerque Police Department's policies in the wake of all the brutality they've been seeing. And we now know that homeless guy whose murder sparked this whole thing, he was shot in the back. He had already surrendered, was walking down off the hill, and for some reason the police just opened up on him. And now, of course, the Albuquerque police are arresting the protesters. You don't have a right to complain about our brutality. Hit him on the head a couple of times. Out in California, another story. Apparently, the SWAT team did a full-on lockdown of this school in California for 4 hours to execute a room-by-room weapons search. The children were not even allowed to leave the classrooms to go to the bathroom. They had to use desks and trash cans to relieve themselves. There was no threat. There was no act of violence. There was no crime. Somebody found an empty carrying case for a firearm out in the parking lot. Probably fell out of somebody's trunk when they were getting something else out. And this is a perfectly legal object that millions of Americans possess. So the police showed up in their $250,000 armored Lenco Bearcat, suited up with their body armor, and did this lockdown of the school for 4 hours, traumatizing these children. No weapon was found. There was no suspect arrested. No threats were made. No crime was committed. Nobody was in any danger whatsoever, other than from the police officers. They're completely out of control. Now, of course, we're still seeing the gun grabbers waxing rhapsodic about what happened out in Santa Barbara with Elliot Rogers, who we now know was on several mind-altering drugs. But, of course, it's the fault of the guns. It's the fault of the guns. The guns are bad. The pills are good. The guns are bad. What the corporate media is not telling you is that here in the United States of America, since May 25th, legally owned firearms have saved at least 7 lives. What? We can't say that guns are useful and guns are beneficial. No, the guns are bad. The pills are good. There's been yet another study on why glyphosate, which is the key ingredient in the Roundup products, has to be banned. And apparently more researchers showing that, oh my goodness, Monsanto lied about the toxicity of Roundup, glyphosate, and its metabolite, AMPA, and they're being found to be far more toxic than the public was being told. Just like they did with their GMO tests. They kept the rats alive for 3 months, then said, okay, it's safe for sale. And as that French study showed, it isn't until the 4th month that the ill effects start to show up. U.S. Geological Survey is now finding traces of glyphosate in 3/4 of all the air and water samples they are taking across the country. It's everywhere, and it's toxic. And just to show you how greedy and how low Monsanto can go, this is a story that came out of sustainablepulse.com. Apparently, Monsanto was able to obtain a patent on a tomato. Okay, this is a conventionally bred tomato. Now, Monsanto's basis for the patent was that it has a resistance to a fungal disease called botrytis. And they implied it was their creation, but it turns out, no, it isn't. This is a naturally occurring resistance to this fungus that was already in existence. And Monsanto got their seeds from the International Gene Bank in Gattersleben, Germany. These plants, it was already known, they had this fungal resistance. And Monsanto wrote up a patent application that created the impression that this was the result of genetic engineering, and this was a new, unique product, and they should get a patent. And the European Patent Court gave it to them because these people working in government offices are not scientists and don't know what they're talking about. Now, there's a huge hue and cry over the fact that Monsanto has set a legal precedent of being able to patent a naturally occurring product. And that is very, very dangerous indeed. Had another mass fish die-off in Galveston Bay, Texas, and once again they're using the phrase, oh, it's oxygen depletion. All these fish it's oxygen depletion. What they're not telling you is what it is that's depleting the oxygen. Now, we know the Gulf of Mexico, and especially around Galveston Bay, a lot of oil and gas drilling going on, a lot of leakage of methane through the water. Now, when methane from oil gas drilling and fracking bubbles up through water, and it encounters free oxygen in the water, it decomposes. And it produces carbon dioxide, which bubbles up out of the water, annoying Al Gore, and it produces more water molecules, which are indistinguishable from the water that was already there. And in the process, it depletes all of the oxygen the fish need to survive. It is not a coincidence that everywhere that they're conducting this fracking, we're seeing streams and ponds and lakes suffering these amazing mass fish die-offs, and they're all blamed on oxygen depletion without mentioning the obvious chemistry that explains it. Fracking is good, solar is bad. It's just all propaganda here. All right, we're coming up on a commercial break here. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. We'll be back in about 3 minutes, and we're going to be talking about Russia is starting to sort of, kind of, maybe pull the plug on GPS stations in its territory. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, for those of you who have been following the situation here with GPS, the global positioning system, and it's in your cell phones and your tablets and your little gizmo in the car, it's actually two parallel operating systems. The system that is in your cell phone and your GPS in the car is the civilian system. And initially, it had a built-in induced error, a wander, so that it couldn't be used to guide something into areas the government did not want guided into. Well, because hobbyists were very quick to come up with ways to take that wobble out, the wobble was disconnected. And civilian GPS is pretty accurate. It's pretty accurate. But the parallel military GPS is amazingly accurate, down to within an inch, anywhere on the globe between, I think it's plus and minus 80 degrees of latitude. Now, as you know, following this ratcheting up of tensions with Russia, Russia had been talking about not continuing the contracts by which U.S. ground stations that support the GPS satellite constellation would not be allowed to continue. Well, Russia's sort of backed off on that, and they're saying because so many people around the world are dependent on the U.S. GPS system, they're going to allow the ground stations for the civilian side to go on, but only the military GPS is going to be shut off inside Russia. Now, this is a major problem for the U.S., because without the full network of ground stations, the accuracy of the military GPS is going to start to degrade. And it's another way where Russia is trying to make their point about their disapproval of all this talk about sanctions and the obvious supplying of the junta in Kiev with the weapons with which they're now slaughtering civilians all across eastern Ukraine. But at the same time, they're saying, well, we're going to let the civilian GPS continue because we understand that there are people and agencies that are dependent on it. Now, over this last commercial break, I was watching on Faux News, and Dick Cheney, they brought him back from his wherever he's recovering from his heart transplant, and he was tearing into Obama about releasing terrorists. We can't release these people. Now, remember, 1/3 of the people in Guantanamo have already been cleared for release by the U.S. military tribunal. They haven't done anything at all. Now, the 5 gentlemen who were released are not accused of terrorism. They are, in fact, high officials of the former Taliban government, ministers, department heads, people like that. And they don't have a history of terrorism. So Dick Cheney's out there says, terrorists, we've got the terrorists, and Obama was wrong for releasing them. They're piling on. They know this is going to be an issue that they can ride all the way to the November elections. And Obama did it to himself. He did it to himself. He was desperate for a public relations stunt, just like he was in Benghazi, and it's blown up in his face. He's going to have to come up with something really big to get out of this mess now here. Getting on to human-caused global warming. Article out of the Washington Times. Pentagon wrestles with bogus climate warnings as funds shifted to the green agenda. And the Pentagon is now complaining that even though they are very generously enriched by you, the American taxpayer, the government has imposed too many mandates on them for spending some of the money in so-called green areas. Remember, we reported this story where the so-called green fuel that is going into military vehicles in these war zones around the world is going for something like $125 a gallon by the time it gets there. It's all just a big money-making situation. Now, here's a quote directly from this article. Pentagon wrestles bogus climate warnings as funds shifted to green agenda. Quote, consultants told the military that by now, California would be flooded by inland seas. The Hague would be unlivable, polar ice would be mostly gone in summer, and global temperatures would rise at an accelerated rate as high as half a degree a year. None of that happened. End quote. None of that happened. All those dire predictions of drowning polar bears and flooding coastlines and snow-free winters, it didn't happen. They got it wrong. And let's face it, the Pentagon isn't enjoying a really good track record right now. They produced the F-22, which is still asphyxiating its pilots 4 years on. The Pentagon gave us the F-35, the world's most expensive aircraft. It's not yet in active service and already obsolete compared with the latest Russian and Chinese fighters. It can't fly in the rain or fog without its electronics messing up. Pentagon gave us the Independence-class littoral combat ships that are so poorly engineered that the first one is already having to be dry docked after less than a year to replace major sections of the hull lost to corrosion. Has nobody ever heard of a zinc sacrificial anode? Now, Obama has, as promised, come out with a major change to combat human-caused global warming. And it appears to be targeted on the coal industry primarily. And he's able to do this without going through Congress by telling the Environmental Protection Agency to set very strict limits on carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants. And then any of these power plants that are exceeding these low thresholds will have to pay a fine to the U.S. government. That fine will then be passed on to you in your electric bills, which means your electric bill is going up to give that money to Obama. It's a money-making scam. We just came out of a record-setting winter. It's June 3rd. There is still ice on Lake Superior. Global warming, we must tax carbon, but only the coal companies' carbon. We are not going to touch the oil companies because they're more generous campaign donors. Now, here's how short-sighted what Obama is doing. And he's doing it just out of greed. He needs the money. Obamacare did not provide the boost in revenues, so it's on to this whole carbon tax thing. But how short-sighted this is. We are in the middle of an oil shortage in this country. The fracking wells are not going to produce the natural gas we were all told they would. In fact, they had to revise down the estimated harvest in California by 96%. So what does Obama do? He goes after and starts hammering coal. There's going to be an energy shortage in this country in his rush to get carbon taxes. There has been no detectable warming of planet Earth for 18 years. And so all these carbon Nazi experts are now convinced that carbon dioxide is even more dangerous than before because it's sneaky, it's hiding. The latest explanation for why all of these dire forecasts of snow-free winters and everything failed is because now carbon dioxide traps the heat and instantly transports it to the bottom of the ocean where it's hiding. But it's down there. Take our word for it. That's their latest explanation for why the world has not warmed. In fact, it's gotten colder. That carbon dioxide's trapping the heat and taking it to the bottom of the ocean. Have you ever heard of convection, people? Okay? Warm water will rise, cold water will sink. Even if you magically transport the heat to the bottom of the ocean, it's not going to stay down there. More about this when we come back from these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, the reason they quit trying to use climate change for all of what's going on here and had to go back to global warming is because the goal is to demonize carbon dioxide, link it to human activity, and then charge us all a fee to supposedly make the problem go away. But we know the world is not warming. After 18 years of no warming, and despite these ridiculous ideas about how carbon dioxide is moving the heat to the bottom of the ocean and hiding it there so you don't see it, and that CO2 did it just to make the government look bad, they're trying to come up with other ways. And now apparently Obama, in one of his speeches on the subject, when he was talking about all this new EPA regulations on coal-fired plants, was saying, well, carbon dioxide, it causes asthma and heart attacks, and it's a threat to national security. Carbon dioxide will tear the tags off your couch cushions. It'll make you miss returning your library books on time. It'll make you pass gas in elevators, and that would be rude. Man, they're just getting desperate here. Up in Canada, they have just passed a rule for meteorologists working for the Canadian government are forbidden from talking publicly about climate change. The official reason being that people who are in meteorology and weather forecasting really are not climate experts, and therefore they should keep their mouths shut. Because most of these meteorologists, both in Canada and the United States, are coming out and saying, this is all nonsense. So Canada is now censoring their own meteorologists from talking about climate change. If you want to know about climate change, go over to this acknowledged and highly paid expert, and he'll tell you what you're supposed to believe. All righty, another scandal here. Apparently, more than 40% of the U.S. HCN station data is a complete fabrication. More fraud. Down in Bolivia, where it's starting to go into the cooler times of the year, sudden snap cold wave has killed 60,000 cattle. All right, we're going to grab a couple of phone calls here. Sonny in Pittsburgh. Aloha, Sonny. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. I've been in the hospitality business for most of my life, and for 10 years of those, I worked at ski areas, companies that would develop ski areas. And during the 99 over into 2000, 2001, when we were trying to get money to develop the ski area, like for lifts, for snowmaking, bankers and the local areas would just say, no, we're not going to have snow in 5 years. Why would we want to develop a ski area? Meanwhile, in the last 10 years, all these ski areas have had record dumps. I mean, and now,
Yeah, they got to open early, and they didn't have to close till really late. Some of them were opened in the middle of last month. Yeah, and all these people who bought into this global warming nonsense have been made complete and utter fools of, and they won't man up and admit to it. It's just led to all kinds of disastrous consequences. Local communities and counties not prepared for the harsh winters and having to pay, premium prices for things like road grit. And, it is amazing. And I'm hoping this will be another reminder. You should not be listening to what the government and the corporate media tells you is going on in the world, because their track record, they're batting 0 right now.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the call, Sonny. We're going to switch over to Curtis in Florida. Aloha, Curtis. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Thanks so much for what you do. You're a wonderful person. I love your program. I wanted to say you're also very funny. When you say things like drugs are bad and guns are good, I mean, I got it backwards, but you're very funny. I love the way you deliver your characterizations of their propaganda effort. I love it.
Well, thank you.
One suggestion I have, you're great, Michael. The one suggestion I have is consider the term carbon commies instead of carbon Nazis for two reasons. The carbon commies want to redistribute wealth by taxing those who are making a good living or doing well and giving it to those who aren't. So they redistribute wealth. Also, they are trying to bring people down sort of industrially to a certain level, whereas the Nazis, on one way, were trying to bring everyone, make all Germans up in another way. So I think carbon commies might be better than carbon Nazis. Back to you, and keep firing away.
All right, well, thank you very much here. I think I went with Carbon Nazis because of the convenient location of the N. And for the longest time, appending Nazi to a word was just something that we saw a lot of on-air talents doing, whether it was Carbonazzi or Feminazi or Feminazi or the rest of it. I'll consider it, but I don't think the communists wanted to bring their industrial base down. I mean, it's kind of a gray situation. We're going to let you go, Curtis, and switch over to Brad in Kentucky. Aloha, Brad. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I just wanted to talk about this new iteration of the show Cosmos. I don't know if you have seen it yet, but I was a fan of the old show with Carl Sagan.
I worked on the old show with Carl Sagan.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Oh, cool. And I had high hopes for the show, but it has degenerated into propaganda, unfortunately. The latest episode was about how we are all in danger of extinction due to man-made global warming.
Yeah, I sort of picked up on that early into the show, that it was a pale, thin version of the original. The original was very good. I loved the show. I had fun on it. I got the book. But I spotted the very obvious propagandistic spin.
I think Mr. Neil deGrasse, is that how you say it, Tyson?
Yeah.
deGrasse, should stick to astrophysics and, stick to science. Please.
Well, again, he's going to say what the script tells him to say because he's making huge amounts of money, and it's going to help his career because he's going to become famous and popular from it. Anything else, Brad?
No, just felt like I was seeing Inconvenient Truth all over again.
Oh, but Al Gore's working on a sequel. Really Inconvenient Truth. The Revenge, The Reckoning, or whatever it's going to be.
Oh, can't wait for that one.
Oh man, look at how much money they're still trying to push this whole idea forward, and it's not going to work. Mother Nature didn't go along. Mother Nature didn't get the memo about warming the place up here.
We're just all a bunch of climate change deniers, aren't we?
Well, that's the name out there. And when they put out stupid stuff like this idea that CO2 magically traps the heat and takes it down to the bottom of the ocean, they're obviously operating from the point of view that we have all gone through Common Core educations and have absolutely no clue about how science works. And maybe that's true for some of the younger kids, but for people of my vintage, yeah, we had a lot of science in school. It was the heyday of the U.S. space program. Everybody had science classes. We were doing chemistry and physics and electronics, and it was all wonderful stuff. And we've grown up remembering the basic fundamental principles of science, like convection. And that's why we know it's more
the
lies.
Scientific method. Yeah.
Yes, it absolutely is. All right, Brad.
Thank you, and have a good one, Mike.
Thanks an awful lot. We're going to switch over to Ted in San Francisco. Aloha, Ted. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing? Thank you for everything that you do. The first thing I want to say to your listenership is to let everyone know that they do have a voice. That calling a congressional member may seem futile, but everyone's sitting in their hands, and your show is great. But people need to take action of some sort, whatever that may be, whatever you find is in your heart, please do. I think that what you're doing is great. I think the global warming issue is one thing, but I definitely do learn a lot from what you're saying. But what's worrying me today is two things, is the Ukraine and the insanity of having NATO forces, cruise missile carriers, right on the coast of Russia, right on the border, of Russia.
Yes.
This actually this to me really scares me. I remember Cold War. I remember the tension. I think we have exceeded that tension at this point. I would love to hear your comment. Then the other thing is, of course, and I think it affects you, is Fukushima. The horrific thing. I mean, and people are wondering, well, what is going on? I'm here in San Francisco, and the Sea Lions are jumping out of the water dead. You could just Google this. Don't believe me. Any of what I say, you could Google. The starfish are dying. The pelicans, the jellyfish, the manta rays. I mean, it's dozens. At least a dozen species are just dying and we're getting a little tip and tap of network news that will talk about it, but nothing that covers the area or approaches it. And their approach, kind of like carbon taxing, is this is what they say.
Okay, Ted, we got to take a break for a commercial. I'm going to let you go now, and when I come back, I will respond to both of your questions, okay? So thank you for the call, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And responding to Ted in San Francisco, I'm absolutely in agreement that all of this military hardware being brought near the borders of Russia, and it should be remembered, Iran, because we reported yesterday, Israel has 3 nuclear-armed submarines patrolling off the shores of Iran. And they're basically saying they're going to be carrying out overt actions, sending SEALs in on the ground and all the rest of that stuff. Now, the issue up in the Black Sea with all of that hardware in there is it is not only a danger if somebody does something really stupid, but it's wide open to the possibility of a false flag. Remember how we got into the Spanish-American War? The USS Maine was sitting in Havana Harbor, and all of a sudden it exploded. The captain of the Maine, Captain Sigsbee, stated there was an onboard fire that touched off the ammunition magazine. That's what destroyed my ship. But William Randolph Hearst and President McKinley said, oh, obviously the man has no sense. It was a Spanish mine. And they went off. Remember the Maine and Spanish-American War. So all it would take would be for Israel or the United States to send a submarine through the Bosphorus, even though it's illegal under the Montrose Convention, sneak it up near one of the U.S. ships and sink it with a torpedo and say, Russia's attacked. And go on off and do that. Start the war that way. I think we'd all be happier if they're talking about a new Cold War, but at this point, it seems like America's financial interests and certainly distracting the American people from all this other nonsense that's going on is going to require a real hot war. And that's very dangerous because the United States is going to lose this one. I got a lot of email from people saying the United States has never lost a war. Do you remember Vietnam? That wasn't a war. That was a police action. Doesn't count. Everybody who goes into a war goes into it thinking they're going to win until they don't. So it's a very dangerous situation. Now, with regard to Fukushima, because of the ocean and wind currents, Hawaii so far has been spared most of the problem. I do have radiation monitors that will monitor the air. They will not detect alpha radiation, and I don't have the equipment necessary to do seawater analysis. I wish I did, but it's very expensive, and I don't have the budget. But so far, we did have a couple of days of intense radiation right after Fukushima melted down. But for the most part these days, we're showing pretty much the normal baseline. We live, obviously, on an extinct volcano, and solidified lava is slightly radioactive. So there's always a little background radiation going on all the time. But I haven't really seen major problems here. Now, that doesn't mean it's not hitting the west coast of Canada in the United States, and people who live in those areas are going to have to be doing radiation measurements, hopefully with instruments that will record alpha waves, because most of the fission byproducts are emitting in alpha, and do occasional seawater tests and even tests of food and produce. The U.S. government isn't going to do it. They don't want to have to do tests that might show that there's a major problem, just like they didn't want to talk about having to test the waters in the Gulf of Mexico following the Gulf oil disaster. But the reality is that between the Fukushima toxification of the North Pacific and the Deepwater Horizon's poisoning of the Gulf of Mexico, supplies of safe and healthy food are no longer adequate to feed the human population, which is why they're just opening up the sluice gates on all these additives and fillers and all this other stuff to go into manufactured food. And that's why they're getting ready to basically declare starving Americans to be zombies and to dispatch them forthwith. Natural News did a test on the new flu vaccine and found it contains 25,000 times the amount of mercury that the EPA says is safe for drinking water. Now, a lot of that, of course, is coming from this mercury-based preservative, and the Department of Homeland Security, the Homeland Security Act, indemnifies vaccine makers from damage caused by their vaccines. So they're loading up this vaccine with mercury-based preservatives, It's 25,000 times what the EPA says is safe for water, and they're pumping it directly into people's bloodstreams. And there is a tremendous amount of evidence linking the autism epidemic to these mercury-based preservatives. It's a heavy metal, and they're pumping it into bloodstreams. Now, earlier in the year, we were talking about this lady, Philomena Lee, and she was a girl who got pregnant out of wedlock, was sent to one of these church-operated homes. Her child was taken from her and sold to rich Americans who wanted to adopt a child. And she spent most of her life trying to find what happened to her child. And they did a movie of it, Philomena, starring Judi Dench. She did a fabulous, fabulous job. Okay? And it's worth seeing. Now, the reason I mention that is because there is a new scandal. Apparently, at the site of one of these Irish homes for unwed mothers that were being run by the church, they found a concrete septic tank with the remains of 800 newborn babies in it. Just amazing. Meanwhile, over in New Jersey, at the diocese there, they have a new excuse why you should not sue the church for sexual molestation of your little children. Because sexual molestation is not an official part of a priest's duties, obviously he was on his own time. And we, the church, cannot be held responsible. That's their latest excuse. You know, he was molesting the kids on his own time. We're not liable. More and more evidence is beginning to surface that this 4-mile-long landslide in Colorado was not a landslide, but an actual fracking eruption. Because the only fracking operation in the area is where this whole thing started to happen. And it's looking like it was either triggered by fracking gases erupting to the surface, or it was an absolute methane blowout. Because down there in the ground, that methane that they're drilling to get sometimes collects in very large pockets under very high pressure. And methane blowouts are a very common cause of oil well disasters, as was the case with the Deepwater Horizon. So you go on down there and you prick that giant methane bubble, and it comes blasting up past the outer casing on the drill well and blows out into the soil. It can kick a lot of ground loose. Meanwhile, over in Switzerland, there's another scandal involving highly radioactive material found in a Swiss landfill, 100 times the permitted amount of radiation, and apparently the government covered it up for 18 months. Didn't want anybody to know about it. Apparently, Canyon Diablo, nuclear plant in California, that is now leaking radiation. Now, I am convinced that all of these things, all the oil wells, nuclear power, can be done safely. You just have to take all of the safety decisions out of the hands of the money junkies, because they're always going to cut corners. Oh, I don't want to build an extra barrier for radiation. I want the money for a yacht. I want a bigger yacht than Paul Allen's got. By the way, if you're a beer drinker, you might want to be a little bit concerned about how your beer is being made, because apparently it's been discovered recently that the use of diatomaceous earth as a filtering material, which is a very common practice used in swimming pools, apparently has been found to be adding arsenic and other toxins to the resulting beer. And they discovered that because they were doing studies on unfiltered versus filtered beer and found the level of arsenic had gone up in the filtered beer. So it wasn't coming from the hops and wasn't coming from the malting barley or any of that stuff. It had to be added by the manufacturing process, and it turns out the source of the arsenic and other nasty chemicals is the diatomaceous earth. Apparently, Comcast charged one of their customers $2,000 for an alarm system that didn't work for 7 years. When it was found out not to be working, the company offered her a $20 credit on her bill. Under public embarrassment, they finally returned all of her money. You need to be careful about those alarms. Make sure they really work. When I was younger, my younger brother had a Fiat, which stands for Fix It Again, Tony, and he had a nice sound system in it, so we went down to Radio Shack and we bought a car alarm. Okay. Bought a car alarm from Radio Shack for his Fiat, installed it, seemed to be working, car got broken into. Turned out the switch was defective. When you pulled the key out of the alarm would turn off. All right, end of the show. I got to go do some errands here. We'll be back tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, stay skeptical, stay angry. Make a point of telling everybody you know, what you learned from this show. Please guide them here to Republic Broadcasting. Guide them to whatreallyhappened.com. We need to really push to break through the matrix that still surrounds our fellow Americans. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.